Imagine waking up to the news that a sitting president of a country has been forcibly taken by another nation. Sounds unbelievable, right? Yet, on January 3rd, 2026, that's exactly what happened. U.S. Special Forces launched airstrikes in Caracas and captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, flying them out of his own country in a stunning operation. Venezuelan officials denounced it as a kidnapping and an imperialist attack, while Washington claimed it was bringing a narco-terrorist to justice. This extreme turn of events, basically the United States abducting a foreign head of state, is the dramatic culmination of a long, deteriorating relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela. What on earth went so wrong? To understand why things have reached this explosive point, we need to travel back in time to when it all began. The story of U.S.-Venezuela relations is a roller coaster spanning decades, from close oil trade partners to bitter adversaries. Let's rewind and explore how a relationship that was once cooperative became so hostile. It might surprise you, but the United States and Venezuela weren't always enemies. In fact, through much of the 20th century, they enjoyed fairly warm ties. American companies heavily invested in Venezuelan oil fields in the early 1900s. And by the 1920s, the U.S. had become the largest buyer of Venezuela's oil exports. For a long time, oil was the glue binding the two nations. Venezuela has one of the world's largest oil reserves, and the U.S. thirsted for that oil. Even during the Cold War, Venezuela, though often led by pro-U.S. governments then, was relatively friendly with Washington. However, beneath the surface, there was always some resentment in Venezuela about U.S. influence and economic dominance. Many Venezuelans felt that foreign, especially American, oil companies reaped huge profits while ordinary people remained poor. This set the stage for an anti-establishment mood. By the 1980s and 90s, Venezuela had economic woes and corruption scandals that fueled public anger at the political elite, and by extension, suspicion of the United States, which was seen as backing those elites. In short, the soil was fertile for a populist nationalist leader to emerge, and emerge he did. Enter Hugo Chavez. In 1999, this outspoken former paratrooper was elected president of Venezuela after campaigning on a fiery anti-establishment, anti-U.S. platform. He called his movement the Bolivarian Revolution, invoking Latin American independence hero Simón Bolívar, and promised to free Venezuela from what he saw as imperialist influence. To many of Venezuela's poor, Chavez was a hero finally standing up to the gringos. But to Washington, he was an unpredictable leftist, ushering in a headache. Chavez wasted no time implementing sweeping changes. He pushed through a new constitution, dramatically expanded state control over the oil industry, and funneled oil revenues into social programs for the poor. Crucially, in 2007, he nationalized oil projects and ousted U.S. oil giants like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips from Venezuela. This move, kicking out major American corporations, really set off alarm bells in Washington and on Wall Street. It signaled that Venezuela under Chavez was not going to play by the usual pro-U.S. economic rules. Chavez's foreign policy further antagonized the U.S. He cozied up to America's rivals and adversaries worldwide. Venezuela built close ties with Cuba's Fidel Castro and later with countries like Russia, China, and Iran, all regimes that the United States mistrusted. From the U.S. perspective, Chavez was creating an anti-American alliance right in Uncle Sam's backyard. Meanwhile, Chavez regularly railed against U.S. imperialism in fiery speeches. He even accused the U.S. of plotting to destabilize his government by funding Venezuelan opposition NGOs and media. In truth, the U.S. did channel money to some anti-Chavez groups through the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID in the early 2000s, which only fed his paranoia. By the early 2000s, relations were in a downward spiral of insults and mistrust. Washington frequently criticized Chavez for authoritarian tendencies, like concentrating power, undermining the free press, and later altering term limits to stay in office. Chavez, for his part, delighted in provoking U.S. leaders. Famously, in 2006 at the United Nations, he mocked President George W. Bush as the devil who left a smell of sulfur at the podium. You can imagine how remarks like that played in Washington. The war of words was on. The war of words escalated into a true crisis in April 2002 when Chávez's presidency faced its most perilous moment, a short-lived coup d'etat. On April 11, 2002, amid mass opposition protests and unrest, a group of Venezuelan military officers detained Chávez and removed him from power for 48 hours. It was a dramatic attempted overthrow of an elected president. During that brief coup, Chávez was literally taken away at gunpoint, effectively kidnapped by rogue generals, and a transitional government under businessman Pedro Carmona was installed. However, the coup regime collapsed within 2 days after loyalist soldiers and huge crowds demanded Chávez's return. Chávez was restored to the presidency on April 14, 2002. Why does this failed coup matter so much? Because Chávez publicly accused the United States of having supported and even instigated the coup, a charge U.S. officials vehemently denied. There is evidence that some U.S. officials and diplomats had met with Venezuelan opposition leaders days before the coup, and the Bush administration was quick to endorse the short-lived new regime, which made Chávez and many Venezuelans deeply suspicious of U.S. involvement. Regardless of the exact role Washington played, in Chávez's mind, April 2002 was proof that the U.S. wanted him gone by any means. As one account noted, this coup laid the foundation for 2 decades of distrust between Caracas and Washington. After surviving the coup, Chávez became even more outspokenly anti-American. He purged the military of officers who might betray him, intensified his Bolivarian revolution, and further aligned with U.S. adversaries globally. The distrust was now entrenched. The United States, for its part, grew increasingly frustrated with Chávez's defiance. U.S. officials started labeling Venezuela a destabilizing force in Latin America. In 2006, Washington imposed its first sanctions on Venezuela's government, ostensibly for failure to cooperate on counterterrorism, marking the formal start of sanction pressure. By 2008, things got so bad that Chávez expelled the U.S. ambassador from Caracas in solidarity with Bolivia, which had done the same, and the Bush administration retaliated by kicking out Venezuela's ambassador. Diplomatic relations were hitting rock bottom. In short, the 2002 coup attempt was a breaking point. From then on, Chávez was convinced the U.S. would stop at nothing to sabotage him, and many in Washington saw Chávez as a virulently anti-American leader to be contained or removed. The friendship was over. It was now an era of open hostility. After 2002, the U.S.-Venezuela relationship never recovered. It just kept getting colder. Chávez remained in power through the 2000s, buoyed by high oil prices which funded popular social programs. He continued to thumb his nose at the U.S., expelling U.S.-backed aid groups he accused of meddling and even ending cooperation with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, claiming the DEA was spying on him. Washington's view of Chávez likewise hardened. He was often described as a dictator in the making and a destabilizing influence in the hemisphere. One major source of conflict was Venezuela's internal slide toward authoritarianism and economic chaos, which the U.S. blamed squarely on Chávez's policies, and Chávez blamed on U.S. sabotage. For example, in 2003-2004, the U.S. supported a peaceful democratic challenge to Chávez, a recall referendum organized by the opposition. Groups like Sumite, led by opposition figure Maria Corina Machado, received U.S. funding and guidance to petition for Chávez's recall. Chávez saw even this democratic mechanism as a Yankee plot. He survived the 2004 recall vote, but was enraged by what he viewed as U.S. interference in Venezuelan democracy. Hugo Chávez passed away in 2013, but the strained relations didn't get any better. In fact, they nosedived further under his successor, Nicolas Maduro. Maduro, Chávez's hand-picked deputy, narrowly won election in 2013 and continued Chávez's socialist anti-U.S. line. If Washington had hoped for a moderation after Chávez, it was quickly disappointed. Maduro lacked Chavez's charisma and presided over an even more severe economic meltdown, but he doubled down on blaming the U.S. for his country's ills. Corruption and mismanagement in Venezuela were rampant, but Maduro pointed to Yankee imperialism and sanctions as the true culprit. Tensions reached a new level in 2015. The year before, protest marches against Chavez's successor had been met with crackdowns. In response, President Barack Obama signed an executive order in 2015 declaring Venezuela an extraordinary threat to U.S. security. This dramatic phrasing became the legal basis for sweeping U.S. sanctions. From Venezuela's perspective, this was wildly provocative. Obama was essentially calling Venezuela an enemy state on par with hostile nations. Caracas blasted the move, claiming the U.S. was inventing pretexts to wage an economic war on Venezuela. And indeed, soon after, the U.S. froze assets and imposed visa bans on top Venezuelan officials accused of human rights abuses. It was the start of what would become a steadily tightening noose of sanctions. These early sanctions in 2014-2015 were a turning point. Venezuela's economy, already mismanaged, slid further into crisis. Shortages of food and medicine grew worse, inflation began to skyrocket, and millions of Venezuelans eventually left the country in desperation. While much of this disaster was due to internal problems and a collapse in oil prices, Maduro argued U.S. sanctions were to blame for Venezuelan suffering. Many Venezuelans indeed saw the U.S. punishments as collective punishment, evidence that Washington wanted to hurt the people to incite a revolt. This perception greatly fueled anti-American sentiment on the ground. In 2017, the Trump administration imposed financial sanctions cutting off Venezuela's access to U.S. capital markets. It even slapped personal sanctions on Maduro himself after he created a new rubber stamp assembly to override Venezuela's opposition-controlled parliament. Maduro's assets in the U.S. were frozen, and he was labeled a human rights abuser by Washington. Around that time, Trump shocked observers by musing publicly about a military option to remove Maduro. This was an explicit threat of invasion, something no U.S. president had voiced in Latin America in decades. Latin American leaders were alarmed. Maduro seized on Trump's words to rally nationalist sentiment, warning that Trump wants to invade us for our oil. Washington didn't invade then, but it continued to tighten the screws economically. By 2019, after Maduro won a deeply disputed re-election in 2018, in a vote many called a sham, the U.S. went all in on regime change. In January 2019, Venezuela's opposition leader Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president, challenging Maduro's legitimacy. Almost immediately, the U.S. and dozens of allies recognized Guaidó as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. This was an unprecedented step. Effectively, the U.S. said Maduro was not the president anymore, even though he still controlled the presidential palace, military, and streets. The U.S. coupled this political move with sweeping new sanctions. It embargoed Venezuelan oil exports, cut off the government from international banking, and even seized Venezuela's U.S.-based oil assets, like Citgo, by turning them over to the Guaidó-led opposition. American officials made it clear their goal was to strangle Maduro's regime financially until it collapsed. From Caracas's viewpoint, this was practically an act of economic war. Even many who disliked Maduro saw the U.S. oil embargo, which caused Venezuela to lose its biggest oil customer overnight, as a ruthless measure hurting ordinary people. Venezuelan inflation, already sky-high, hit an insane 345,000% by 2019. The healthcare system crumbled and hunger spread. Maduro held on with help from Russia, China, and Cuba, but Venezuela was in agony. The U.S. insisted Maduro was to blame for the suffering. Maduro insisted it was the U.S. blockade. Either way, Venezuelans' bitterness toward Washington deepened as the sanctions dragged on. Through all this, Maduro also faced so many challenges to his rule, some almost unreal. Perhaps the most bizarre was Operation Gideon in May 2020, a ragtag invasion attempt by foreign mercenaries. A group of around 60 Venezuelan dissidents and a couple of ex-U.S. Green Beret soldiers tried to sneak into Venezuela by boat from Colombia to capture Maduro. The plan was like something out of an action movie. Indeed, Maduro quipped it looked like a bad Rambo movie. The mercenary team was quickly captured by Venezuelan authorities, and 2 American ex-soldiers were paraded on TV in handcuffs. Maduro accused the U.S. of directly backing this foolish coup attempt, given one invader was a U.S. veteran who claimed to have contacts with Trump's security officials. Washington denied it, and it truly was a freelance fiasco, but the event only reinforced Venezuela's belief that the U.S. was willing to use force, even covertly, to oust Maduro. By now, you can see the pattern. Each U.S. action, sanctions, backing Maduro's rivals, harsh rhetoric, made the Venezuelan leadership more anti-American. And each Venezuelan action, crushing the opposition, cozying to U.S. foes, refusing to budge, made the U.S. more intent on pressuring Maduro. A classic downward spiral. Fast forward to the 2020s. Relations remained ice cold during a brief thaw attempt in early 2023, when the U.S. under a different administration tried mild engagement and eased a few oil sanctions. But any hopes of mending ties were short-lived. By 2024, Venezuela's political crisis worsened again. Maduro claimed victory in another disputed election, which the U.S. and many other countries denounced as fraudulent. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he brought a very hardline stance on Venezuela. Trump had never hidden his desire to see Maduro gone. Now he moved aggressively to make it reality. Immediately in January 2025, after Maduro's contested swearing in for a new term, the U.S. rejected Maduro's legitimacy and put a multi-million-dollar bounty on his head. In fact, on Jan 10, 2025, the very day Maduro took the oath, Washington offered $25 million for information leading to Maduro's arrest. Later in 2025, they doubled the reward to $50 million, labeling him a global terrorist leader of a supposed drug cartel. This was basically the Wild West poster approach, placing a huge bounty on a foreign president, something not seen in modern international politics. It signaled the U.S. was now treating Maduro like a wanted criminal, not a head of state. Trump's team also reversed any détente policies. They revoked permits that had allowed some companies, like Chevron, to operate in Venezuela despite sanctions. They ended protections for Venezuelan migrants in the U.S., sending some detained migrants back to Caracas on planes, and they ramped up hostile rhetoric, even calling Maduro a narco-terrorist and Venezuela a state sponsor of drug trafficking, though experts noted the so-called Cartel of the Suns, allegedly led by Maduro, was unproven as an organized cartel. By mid-2025, the Trump administration's approach became maximum pressure on steroids. Over the late summer and fall, the U.S. started a quasi-military campaign around Venezuela. In August 2025, a massive U.S. naval fleet, the largest seen in the Caribbean in generations, deployed near Venezuela's coast. Warships, including the Navy's biggest aircraft carrier, conducted exercises under ominous code names like Operation Southern Spear. Then came the drones and missiles. Starting in September 2025, the U.S. launched repeated airstrikes against small boats leaving Venezuelan ports, claiming they were hitting drug smuggling vessels. At least 100-plus people were killed in these strikes on boats, actions human rights groups said could amount to war crimes. The U.S. Navy also seized Venezuelan oil tankers at sea on accusations of sanction dodging. This was essentially a naval blockade and bombardment, even though no formal war was declared. Washington argued it was all an anti-narcotics operation, but to Venezuela and much of the world, it looked like the prelude to an invasion. Tensions hit a boiling point. In late November 2025, Trump reportedly gave Maduro an ultimatum: leave power voluntarily and accept safe exile, or else. Trump even dangled an offer of safe passage if Maduro fled to another country. Maduro flatly refused. He went on TV defiantly, saying he would not accept a slave's peace and charged that the U.S. really just wanted to control Venezuela's oil wealth. Both sides were now openly talking about regime change. The final straw came on January 3rd, 2026. In the pre-dawn hours, Venezuela awoke to the unthinkable. American warplanes and drones were bombing targets in and around Caracas, the capital. Blasts rocked military bases in the vicinity of the presidential palace, Miraflores. Amid the shock and chaos, U.S. Chinook helicopters ferried a special forces team into the heart of Caracas. Their mission was unprecedented: to extract President Maduro from his own country by force. And incredibly, they succeeded. By sunrise, the U.S. had abducted Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, and whisked them away to a waiting Navy ship. President Trump announced a few hours later that Maduro was in U.S. custody, posting a triumphant photo of a blindfolded, handcuffed Maduro on an American warship as proof. It was the ultimate culmination of the hostility, an outright regime change operation carried out through military force without international authorization. To Venezuelans, this was nothing short of an invasion and kidnapping. The government in Caracas, those remaining, called it an extremely serious aggression and rushed to declare Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as interim president in Maduro's absence. Even many who opposed Maduro were uneasy with a foreign power physically removing their leader. It was a huge blow to national sovereignty and pride. Around the world, allies and adversaries of the U.S. were stunned by this brazen interference. Comparisons were made to the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989, when the U.S. similarly captured Panama's leader, Manuel Noriega. International law experts pointed out that forcibly abducting a sitting president without UN approval violated core principles of sovereignty. In Caracas, people took to the streets, some in anger at the US, some in celebration that Maduro was gone, but all in a state of shock at the dawn raids. And that is how we arrived at this extraordinary moment. What went wrong between the U.S. and Venezuela? In summary, nearly everything. Over the span of 25 plus years, a toxic mix of ideological conflict, oil politics, and by oil politics, well, you know what we mean, and mutual provocations turned one-time oil partners into bitter foes. Venezuela went anti-U.S., largely because successive U.S. administrations openly and covertly tried to shape Venezuelan politics, funding opposition groups, supporting a 2002 coup attempt, imposing punishing sanctions that wrecked the economy, endorsing parallel leaders, and ultimately resorting to military force. The U.S., on the other hand, saw Venezuela go from a friendly democracy to a defiant authoritarian state that forged alliances with America's enemies and trampled democratic norms, something Washington felt it had to counter. Each side will say the other is at fault, but clearly both contributed to the downward spiral. In the end, it's a tragic story. The U.S. and Venezuela are now at a point of direct confrontation that seemed unimaginable decades ago. A sitting Venezuelan president was literally taken prisoner by the United States, marking a low in inter-American relations. Where does it go from here? It's hard to say. The road to this point was long and lined with mistakes and misdeeds on both sides. One can only hope that understanding what went wrong, from the anger over oil and imperialism to coups and sanctions to the final drastic act of kidnapping a head of state, can offer lessons for the future. Because if these two nations ever seek to rebuild trust, they'll first have to confront the deep history of distrust and intervention that brought them to this perilous juncture. In the meantime, the saga of the U.S. and Venezuela stands as a stark example of how badly relations can deteriorate when power, ideology, and oil collide, with real human consequences. And as of now, it's a saga that is still unfolding, its ultimate resolution uncertain. Again, what went wrong? Almost everything, and the world is watching to see what happens next.